Deep in the heart of what was once Nazi Germany, behind layers of concrete thick enough to withstand direct bomb hits, lies one of the most unbelievable discoveries of the post-war era. Picture this. A colossal aircraft hangar, its entrance sealed with steel doors weighing several tons each, and inside, row after perfect row of Messerschmitt fighter planes, Focke-Wulf interceptors, and experimental aircraft that never saw combat. 300 warplanes, many still bearing their factory-fresh paint, their engines silent, their propellers motionless, entombed in darkness for decades. This isn't a museum. This isn't a memorial. This is a tomb, a graveyard of machines that cost the equivalent of billions in today's currency. Aircraft that were supposed to turn the tide of the war, now frozen in time like mechanical ghosts. The question that haunts historians to this day is simple, yet deeply disturbing. Why would anyone seal away 300 perfectly functional fighter planes instead of destroying them or putting them to use? What you're about to discover challenges everything you thought you knew about the final days of World War II and reveals a secret so massive, so tragic, that it remained hidden from the world for over 3 decades. By the end of this video, you'll understand why this hangar represents not just a military mystery, but a symbol of the absolute chaos and madness that consumed Nazi Germany in its dying moments. Stay with me, because the truth behind these sealed aircraft is far more shocking than you could possibly imagine. The year is 1945, and the Third Reich is collapsing at a speed that defies comprehension. What Adolf Hitler promised would be a 1,000-year empire is disintegrating in just 12 years, crumbling under the combined weight of Soviet forces pushing from the east and Allied armies crushing from the west. The Luftwaffe, once the most feared air force in the world, has been reduced to a shadow of its former glory. Fuel shortages have become so severe that even when planes are available, there's barely enough petroleum to get them airborne. Experienced pilots, the men who once terrorized the skies over London and Stalingrad, are now dead, captured, or too few to make any difference. The German industrial machine, despite producing aircraft at an astonishing rate right up until the final weeks of the war, faces an impossible reality. They're building planes faster than they can find qualified pilots to fly them or fuel to power them. In underground factories carved into mountains, in dispersed workshops hidden in forests, workers continue assembling fighter planes even as Soviet artillery shells fall closer each day. It's industrial insanity, a production line that cannot stop even as the nation around it burns. In this atmosphere of desperation and denial, military commanders face impossible decisions about what to do with the hundreds of aircraft that sit ready but useless across Germany. The hangar in question was constructed in 1943 as part of Germany's massive effort to protect its air force from the relentless Allied bombing campaign. This wasn't just any hangar. This was a fortress disguised as an aircraft shelter, built into the side of a mountain with reinforced concrete walls measuring over 6 feet thick in some places. The entrance was designed to be concealed from aerial reconnaissance, camouflaged with netting and false structures that made it appear from above as nothing more than natural terrain. Inside, the hangar stretched over 1,500 feet in length and stood nearly 100 feet high at its peak, a cathedral of concrete and steel dedicated to the Nazi war machine. The floor was solid, reinforced concrete, smooth enough to move aircraft easily, but strong enough to support the weight of hundreds of tons of military hardware. Massive ventilation systems, now silent and rusted, once cycled air through the space to prevent moisture buildup that could damage sensitive aircraft instruments. Electric lighting ran the entire length of the structure, and fuel lines were built directly into the floor, allowing rapid refueling without the need to transport aviation fuel in vulnerable tanker trucks. This was engineering on a scale that commanded respect even from the Allied forces who would eventually discover it. But the hangar itself is only part of the story. What matters is what was placed inside. Starting in early 1945, as Soviet forces began their final push toward Berlin, German Air Force commanders received urgent orders to relocate aircraft from bases in the east to more secure locations in the west and south. Trains arrived at night, carrying partially disassembled fighters on flatbed cars. Trucks rumbled through forests on hidden roads, transporting wings, fuselages, and engine components. The assembly continued inside the hangar at a frantic pace. Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters, the backbone of the Luftwaffe throughout the war, were rolled into position, their distinctive angular lines and yellow-painted nose cones creating an almost hypnotic pattern when viewed from the hangar entrance. Each one of these aircraft cost approximately 42,000 Reichsmarks to produce, equivalent to roughly $300,000 in today's currency when adjusted for inflation and relative economic value. Beside them stood the more advanced Focke-Wulf FW-190 fighters, heavier and more powerful, capable of carrying bombs as well as engaging enemy aircraft. These cost even more, with each unit representing nearly $500,000 in modern equivalent value. But the truly staggering elements were the experimental and advanced aircraft mixed among the conventional fighters. Messerschmitt Me 262s, the world's first operational jet fighters, were positioned near the back of the hangar. These revolutionary aircraft, capable of speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour, cost a fortune to produce and represented the cutting edge of aeronautical engineering. Each jet fighter represented an investment of over $1 million in today's terms when you factor in the research, development, and exotic materials required for their construction. The scene inside the hangar would have been absolutely surreal to witness. Imagine walking through those massive steel doors and seeing nothing but aircraft extending into the darkness, their wings almost touching, arranged with Germanic precision in perfect rows. The smell of aviation fuel, machine oil, and fresh paint would have been overwhelming in the enclosed space. Maintenance equipment stood ready beside each plane. Tool carts, portable generators, fire extinguishers, ammunition carts loaded with 20mm cannon shells and machine gun belts. Some aircraft still had their factory paperwork attached to the cockpit, documentation that tracked every component and every test flight. Personal items left by workers and pilots littered the area, coffee cups on workbenches, cigarette butts crushed on the floor, technical manuals left open to specific pages as if someone had just stepped away and planned to return. The cockpits themselves were fully equipped with instruments, radios, gun sights, and in some cases even the seat cushions and safety harnesses were still in place. These weren't stripped hulks or damaged aircraft relegated to spare parts. These were ready-to-fly machines, lacking only fuel in their tanks and pilots in their seats. Conservative estimates placed the total value of the aircraft inside this single hangar at over $200 million in current currency, and that's being modest. Some historians argue the true value, especially considering the research and development costs for the experimental jets, pushes closer to $500 million in today's money. This was wealth on a staggering scale, military capability that represented years of industrial effort and scientific advancement, all sitting silent in the darkness. As the war entered its final chaotic weeks in April and early May of 1945, the situation around the hangar became increasingly desperate. The original plan, if it could be called that, was to use these aircraft in a last-ditch defense of the Reich, to throw every available plane into the sky in one final massive air battle that might somehow turn the tide. But reality intervened in the cruelest possible way. There was no fuel to fly 300 aircraft. There weren't enough experienced pilots even if fuel existed. The Allied air forces controlled the skies so completely that launching fighters from the ground had become essentially suicidal. Radio communications had broken down to the point where coordinated operations were impossible. The infrastructure needed to support combat operations, from radar stations to ground control centers to repair facilities, had been bombed into rubble. And perhaps most critically, There was no longer a coherent military command structure capable of organizing such an effort. Officers who might have commanded these aircraft were dead, surrendered, or fleeing westward ahead of Soviet forces. The Nazi government itself was fragmenting, with different factions and individuals making contradictional decisions, sometimes within the same organization. In this atmosphere of complete military and governmental collapse, someone made the decision that would seal the fate of these 300 aircraft. The order came down through what remained of the Luftwaffe command structure in late April 1945. Seal the hangar. Don't destroy the aircraft. Don't attempt to fly them west to surrender to the Americans or British. Don't even disable them. Simply seal the hangar and abandon it. The reasoning behind this bizarre command reveals the twisted logic of the Reich's final days. Some commanders believed, despite all evidence to the contrary, that Germany might still somehow negotiate a favorable peace, and that hidden stockpiles of military equipment would provide leverage in those negotiations. Others thought that the war might pause, that there might be a ceasefire during which these aircraft could be retrieved and used. The most delusional believed that Nazi Germany would rise again, that this was merely a temporary setback, and that these sealed aircraft would form the core of a restored Luftwaffe sometime in the future. There were also more practical, if equally futile, considerations. Destroying 300 aircraft would require explosives and personnel that were needed elsewhere. It would create massive fires visible for miles, potentially drawing Allied bombers or artillery fire. And there was genuine fear among some officers that destroying such valuable equipment might be viewed as a war crime by whoever won the war, that they personally might be held accountable for wasting resources that could have been surrendered intact. So instead of destruction, they chose concealment. The sealing operation took less than 48 hours. Engineering units, some of the last organized military formations still following orders, moved in with welding equipment, concrete, and steel plates. They sealed every entrance to the hangar, welding steel doors shut from the outside, and in some cases pouring quick-setting concrete into door frames to make them even more secure. Ventilation shafts were blocked with rubble and concrete. Windows, if any existed, were bricked up. The external camouflage was reinforced to make absolutely certain that aerial observation wouldn't reveal the location. Documents relating to the hangar's contents were destroyed or scattered, with no central record kept of exactly what had been sealed inside or where. The workers who performed the sealing were then reassigned, sent to other duties, or simply told to disperse and head home if possible. Within days, the area around the hangar became a battlefield as Soviet and American forces converged. The fighting moved on, the front lines shifted, and the sealed hangar remained, anonymous and forgotten, just one more bunker among thousands scattered across Germany. What had been a hive of activity just days before became absolutely silent. 300 aircraft sat in total darkness, their instruments slowly losing calibration, their fuel lines drying out, their rubber seals beginning to deteriorate, their metal surfaces starting the slow process of corrosion in the stagnant air. The hangar remained sealed not for months, but for years. Not for a few years, but for decades. The property fell into a legal grey area after the war, located in territory that changed hands between occupying forces and eventually became part of a divided Germany. Local residents knew something was there, knew that the mountain concealed military installations, but the exact nature and contents remained unknown. Stories circulated, as they always do, about secret Nazi weapons, about gold bullion hidden underground, about experimental aircraft and wonder weapons sealed away. Most dismissed these as legends, the kind of fantastic tales that always emerge in the aftermath of such a catastrophic war. Allied intelligence had some records indicating significant Luftwaffe activity in the area, but with thousands of such sites to investigate and many more pressing concerns during the reconstruction of Europe, this particular location never rose to the top of any priority list. The Cold War created new tensions and new secrets, and old Nazi bunkers became less interesting than current Soviet military movements. The hangar might have remained sealed indefinitely, its contents deteriorating into unrecognizable scrap metal, except for an accident of history. In the early 1970s, nearly 30 years after the war's end, construction crews preparing to build a highway in the region began preliminary geological surveys. Their ground-penetrating equipment detected massive voids in the mountain, far larger than natural caves. Further investigation revealed the reinforced concrete structure, and eventually, through archived documents that had been declassified, engineers pieced together that this was a wartime aircraft hangar. The decision about what to do with the discovery fell to local authorities and historians. Opening the hangar became a priority, not for military reasons, obviously, but for historical preservation and understanding. The unsealing process took weeks. The steel doors had rusted and fused, requiring cutting torches to breach. Concrete had to be carefully removed to avoid collapse of the structure. When engineers finally managed to create an opening large enough to enter, they brought portable lights and cameras, not knowing what condition the interior might be in after 3 decades of absolute isolation. What they found exceeded every expectation and confirmed the most fantastic rumors. The aircraft were still there, all 300 of them, exactly as they had been left in 1945. The dry, sealed environment had protected them far better than anyone could have anticipated. Paint was faded in places, and dust covered every surface in a thick grey blanket. But the fundamental integrity of the aircraft remained largely intact. Landing gear had compressed slightly under the weight, and tires had rotted away in some cases, but the airframes themselves showed remarkably little structural damage. The real deterioration was internal and invisible at first glance. Fuel lines had degraded, hydraulic systems had failed, electrical wiring had corroded, instruments had seized up, and engine components had begun to rust. These aircraft would never fly again without complete rebuilding, but as historical artifacts, as evidence of the Third Reich's final days, they were absolutely priceless. The discovery made international news, though not with the fanfare you might expect. By the 1970s, wartime aircraft discoveries were not uncommon, and the political sensitivity of dealing with Nazi artifacts meant that coverage was often muted. What happened next reveals the true tragedy of the sealed hangar. German authorities, in consultation with museums and historical societies, began the process of cataloguing and removing the aircraft for preservation. They quickly discovered several problems. First, 300 aircraft was far more than any single museum could accommodate or preserve. Second, many of the aircraft were common types that already existed in museum collections around the world, making them less valuable from a preservation standpoint than the rare experimental models. Third, and most critically, the cost of properly preserving 300 wartime aircraft exceeded available budgets by a massive margin. Each aircraft would require careful disassembly, transport, cleaning, treatment to prevent further corrosion, climate-controlled storage, and extensive documentation. The total cost would run into tens of millions of dollars, and in the 1970s, that funding simply didn't exist for this purpose. A painful decision was made. The rarest and most historically significant aircraft, perhaps 40 or 50 planes, including the Me-262 jets and some experimental variants, would be preserved. The rest would be scrapped for metal. Workers returned to the hangar with cutting torches, and the sound of metal being sliced apart echoed through the space where these aircraft had sat silent for 3 decades. Messerschmitt 109s that had cost $300,000 each to build were reduced to scrap aluminum sold for pennies per pound. The entire tragic cycle completed itself. Built at enormous cost, sealed instead of destroyed, preserved accidentally by abandonment, then destroyed anyway for lack of resources to maintain them. Today the hangar still exists, though it's no longer sealed. It's been converted into a combination storage facility and occasional museum space, with a small section dedicated to telling the story of what was found there. A few aircraft remain in the original location, too degraded to move safely, but preserved in place as monuments to the discovery. Photos from the initial unsealing show the rows of aircraft stretching into the darkness, a sight that will never be seen again because it can never be recreated. Those images capture a moment of absolute historical significance, a direct visual link to the final chaotic days of Nazi Germany, and they raise questions that still lack complete answers. Who exactly gave the order to seal the hangar? Was it a local commander acting independently, or did the directive come from higher up in the fragmenting Nazi hierarchy? Were there other hangars like this, other sealed repositories of military equipment that haven't been discovered yet? Most tantalizingly, what happened to the documentation that would have explained the strategic thinking, if it can be called that, behind sealing rather than destroying these aircraft? Some historians argue that the sealed hangar represents the ultimate expression of Nazi delusion, the belief that somehow the war wasn't really over, that there would be a future need for these aircraft, that the Third Reich would rise again from its ashes. Others see it more pragmatically as a desperate attempt to preserve assets for bargaining purposes, or simply as the decision of military officers too psychologically broken by defeat to follow through on destruction orders that would have required acknowledging final defeat. The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle, complicated by the fact that different people involved in the decision likely had different motivations and different levels of understanding about Germany's actual military situation. What cannot be disputed is the physical reality of what was sealed and what was lost. 300 frontline aircraft, representing cutting-edge military technology and billions in economic value, sat unused while Germany desperately needed them, then sat abandoned for 3 decades, then were mostly destroyed anyway. The waste is staggering on every level, human, economic, and historical. The discovery of the hangar also opened new questions about the final weeks of the war, and how much equipment was hidden rather than destroyed or surrendered. Allied forces at the end of the war seized enormous quantities of German military hardware, but intelligence analysts have always suspected that significant amounts were successfully concealed. For every sealed hangar that's been discovered, how many remain unknown, their contents slowly deteriorating in darkness? Modern Germany is dotted with abandoned military installations from the Nazi era, many of them still unexplored, many of them located in areas that are now nature preserves or private property where investigation is difficult. Ground-penetrating technology has improved dramatically since the 1970s, and occasional discoveries continue to be made. But a systematic survey of potential sites has never been undertaken, partly because of cost, and partly because of the sensitive politics involved in searching for Nazi artifacts. The 300 aircraft in this hangar might represent only a fraction of what's still hidden, waiting to be found. So I'm asking you now, what do you think? Do you believe there are more sealed hangars like this one still waiting to be discovered somewhere in the forests and mountains of Central Europe? Could there be other massive stockpiles of military equipment hidden by commanders who couldn't accept defeat, now sitting forgotten while the people who sealed them are long dead? And perhaps more importantly, what would you do with such a discovery if you were in charge? Would you commit the resources necessary to preserve everything for historical understanding? Or would you make the same difficult choice that was made in the 1970s, saving only the most significant examples and scrapping the rest? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, because this conversation touches on fundamental questions about how we value history, how we preserve memory, and what we owe to future generations trying to understand one of the darkest periods in human civilization. The 300 aircraft of the sealed hangar are mostly gone now, reduced to metal ingots and spare parts. But their story remains, a testament to the chaos and tragedy of war's end, and a reminder that sometimes the most significant historical discoveries reveal not treasures, but waste, not glory, but futility. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into the mysteries and hidden stories of World War II.